My name is
These
Zale
specimens
Coase, and
are
I want it on the
unstable. One
official
mistake
record
and
that none of
understand
this
the
was my
risks,
idea.
but we
I
need
know
their
how that
properties.
sounds.
Proceed
I
with
know it
caution.
sounds exactly
Are you
like
all right?
something
Can
a
you
person
move?
says
He is
when
not
they are in
safe
fact
here. I'll
responsible
be
for
fine.
everything
Just
that is
help me
about
up.
to follow.
Let's go.
But I am asking you to hold that judgment for just a little while longer, because by the time I finish telling you what happened on Vorakneth, you will
Behold the
understand
power
that
I
the word
wield.
idea implies a level
None
of
can
agency
stand
I
against
simply
this
did not have
force.
that day. I was not the predator in this story. I just did not know that yet. I want you to picture a small table in a market corridor. I want you to picture a woman sitting across from me, a battered notebook open in front of her, a pen laid across the top of it like an invitation. I want you to picture her looking at me with dark, steady eyes that have seen enough things to have stopped being surprised by most of them. And I want you to hear what she says, which is simply, "Do you know Helix Station 4th level commercial corridor?" And I want you to understand that when she asked me that question, I have already been awake for 19 hours. I have attempted and failed to steal her bag. My partner is sitting beside me, rubbing the circulation back into his wrists, and I have just learned something about the last 15 years of my life that I am not yet fully ready to put into words. I reach out, I pick up the pen. That is where this ends. But it does not start there. It starts the way most things in my life start, which is with Brick saying something I should not listen to. Vorakneth is not the kind of station that appears in travel guides. It does not appear in commercial databases under any category marked recommended or family-friendly or suitable for diplomatic delegations. What it appears under, if you know which filters to turn off, is a category that translates roughly from 7 different galactic languages into the same basic concept: functional. It functions. That is the most honest thing anyone has ever said about Vorakneth. It orbits a dim orange star at the edge of what the humans call the Orion Spur, which is already a name that tells you everything you need to know about human naming conventions, because an entire arm of a galaxy is not a spur of anything, but humans named it anyway with the casual confidence of a species that decided somewhere in its evolutionary history that the universe was ultimately theirs to label. The station has 17 levels. The lower 8 are what the official documentation refers to as high-density commercial corridors, and what everyone else calls the place where you do not make eye contact. There are market stalls that have been in the same location for 40 standard years, selling things whose origins nobody asks about to people whose names nobody learns. There are security personnel who have developed a highly specialized skill for looking in precisely the wrong direction at exactly the right moment. I had been working the lower market corridor for 6 rotations. Good work. Clean work. The kind of work that requires 15 years of practice, forearms, and a nervous system that can process 17 different spectrums of visible light simultaneously. I am a scabble. We are not a large species physically. We are not the strongest, not the most imposing, not the kind of creature that walks into a room and causes other creatures to reconsider their life choices on a purely instinctual level. What we are is precise. My forearms move in coordination that most species find unsettling to watch, each one capable of independent, fine motor operation, while the other 3 do something entirely different. My skin is silver gray, the texture of polished stone. And my eyes are, if I am permitted a moment of professional pride, extraordinary. 17 spectrums, not 17 in theory. 17 in practice in real time, simultaneously including thermal bands that let me read the heat signature of a pulse at just under 30 meters in a crowded corridor. I can tell when someone's heart rate elevates before they can tell themselves. This is a useful skill. It is, as I would discover, considerably more useful on the other side of the equation than the one I had been using it for. Brix, my partner of 6 rotations, had none of these advantages and compensated for this with a confidence that I can only describe as geological in its stability. Nothing shook it, not logic, not evidence, not the 17 times in 6 years that his assessments of a situation had been demonstrably, sometimes catastrophically wrong. Brix was a thoric, short, green-skinned, with the moral architecture of something that had evolved in a very competitive environment and decided that ethics were a luxury for species with more favorable odds. He had 4 years of back-alley brawling experience, 0 situational awareness, and an absolute gift for identifying the targets he believed were easy. The thing about Brix was not that he was useless. He was, in his specific way, exactly as useful as a rock thrown at a hornet's nest. Occasionally the rock hit something, more often it simply introduced a new and more urgent problem. I kept him around because, in 15 years of working the lower corridors of the galactic criminal ecosystem, I had learned one thing above all others: when things go wrong, and things always go wrong, eventually what matters is not how fast you are in absolute terms. What matters is whether there is someone nearby who is slower than you. I say this with genuine affection, mostly. We were positioned near a bioluminescent fungal display, one of Voronezh's few legitimate attractions, a cluster of organisms from a humid world, 3 systems over, that glowed in shifting blues and greens and occasionally a deep pulsing violet that made newer visitors stop and stare with their mouths open and their bags unguarded. It was an ideal working location. I had used it 11 times in this rotation cycle alone. That morning, the corridor was running at approximately 70% capacity, enough bodies to provide cover. Not so many that movement became unpredictable. A merchant 3 stalls down was running some kind of promotional display involving a species of small, loud creature I did not recognize, which was generating exactly the right amount of ambient noise and distraction. Conditions were good. Brix clicked his tongue. It meant he had spotted something. I followed his gaze down the corridor. That was when I first saw her. I should tell you about humans. If you are encountering this account without prior exposure to the species, you are not prepared. Nobody is ever prepared. This is, I have come to understand, essentially the entire problem. Humans arrived at the galactic community approximately 40 standard years before the events of this story. In cosmic terms, this is the equivalent of showing up extremely late to a gathering of civilizations that have been developing mutual understanding frameworks for centuries, announcing that you have brought your own food and then somehow ending up running the kitchen. The rest of the galaxy had spent those centuries building careful diplomatic infrastructure, elaborate protocols, mutual respect agreements, shared communication frameworks so nuanced that entire academic institutions had grown up around their study. Humans had spent the same period apparently doing something called competitive sports, developing a category of food so thermally aggressive it caused gastrointestinal distress in 4 known species upon indirect exposure, and engaging in a pattern of conflict with each other that, when described to a grinny elder of my acquaintance, caused him to excuse himself quietly and go lie down in a darkened room for what turned out to be several hours. They were, by every metric the galactic community had developed for evaluating newly contacted species, chaotic, unpredictable, and statistically improbable. I had heard stories from other operators in the lower corridors. A human customs officer who had processed 700 cargo violations in a single shift and then asked the station chef for a recipe. A human medic who had performed emergency surgery on 3 different species simultaneously in a damaged transport, using equipment designed for none of them, and had afterward complained mainly about the poor quality of the lighting. The galactic community had spent centuries developing careful protocols for dangerous situations. Humans seemed to treat dangerous situations the way other species treated mildly inconvenient ones, with a focused practical attention that somehow made everything more alarming rather than less. They were also according to every piece of intelligence that had filtered through the criminal networks I operated in extraordinarily easy marks. Sentimental, trusting to the point of structural vulnerability. They carried large bags filled with items that had no monetary value. Photographs of family members, small fabric toys, handwritten notes on actual physical paper, and they cared about these items with an intensity that was entirely disproportionate to their resale potential, which meant that when you took the bag, the human would be too emotionally disrupted to think clearly about pursuit. That was the theory. The human walking through the lower market corridor of Voronezh did not in retrospect look like the theory. She looked like something else entirely, but I did not understand that yet. She was young by human standards. Mid-20s. Dark hair pulled back in that particular human style I had learned was called a ponytail, a name that I have investigated and found no satisfactory explanation for. She wore a jacket that had seen significant use, the kind of worn functional clothing that in my experience belonged either to serious travelers or to people who had simply stopped caring what anyone thought of their appearance, and I was not yet certain which category applied here. She carried a large canvas bag over her left shoulder. Even at this distance, the visual weight of it was obvious. Whatever was inside, there was a lot of it. "Look at the bag," Brick said. "The way she's not even shifting the strap. She's barely registering the weight." I was already looking, not at the bag, at her eyes. Most tourists looked at things. The displays, the vendors, the bioluminescent organisms pulsing blue and green in their case. They looked at the world of Voronezh, the way people look at something new, which is directly with attention focused on surfaces. This woman was looking at the space between things, the gaps in foot traffic, the sight lines, the positions of the security presence such as it was. Her gaze moved in a pattern I recognized from 15 years of professional observation because it was the same pattern I used. And I used it because it was the pattern of someone who was not a tourist, but a practitioner. "She's human," Brick said with the tone of someone explaining the obvious to someone slow. "They don't notice things. One of them tried to buy the Vorkan ambassador's ceremonial headdress last cycle. Thought it was a market stall item. That story does not make me more confident, I said. That makes me think humans are chaotic in ways I cannot model. 50 credit, Brick said. Says you can't take that bag without her noticing. I looked at him. That is not an incentive, I said. That is a dare. Yes, he said. He was smiling. This was the moment. I want you to understand that I saw it clearly. I am a professional. 15 years of reading situations, reading people, reading the thermal signatures of pulses in crowded corridors. I saw the warning in this moment, the way you see a warning sign on a dark road. Clearly, unambiguously. And then I looked at the woman walking through the lower market corridor, and I activated my full spectral range, and I saw something that I immediately and incorrectly decided was confirmation rather than alarm. Her pulse was 58 beats per minute. For a human navigating a crowded transit station, that was not just calm. That was the resting heart rate of something that had evolved to be calm in exactly this kind of environment. I had read human physiology briefings. The average human in a moderately stressful situation ran somewhere between 75 and 90. What I was reading was not tourist. What I was reading was not someone who had wandered into the lower market corridor by accident. What I should have concluded from this, do not proceed. What I actually concluded, because professional pride is a disease with no known cure, she is either very experienced or very well medicated. And either way, a 50 credit bet is beneath my dignity to refuse. I started moving. And here is the first thing I did not understand until much later. She slowed down by exactly the right amount, by the margin that would bring her to the junction at the precise moment my approach vector would put me 2 meters behind her. Not a stumble, not hesitation, a calibration so small that my professional pattern recognition filed it under normal pedestrian variation and moved on. She had not been walking through the corridor. She had been setting a pace for me to follow. I did not know this yet. I started moving. 15 years of practiced technique is not nothing. I want you to understand this, not because I am making excuses, but because what happened next is significantly more impressive if you understand what I was doing when it failed. The approach from behind and to the left matching the target's pace exactly so that footsteps overlap and become inaudible. The forearm coordination, 2 for balance and misdirection, 2 for the actual work. All 4 operating independently but in sequence, rehearsed 10,000 times until the motion required no conscious direction at all. Unhook the strap, take the weight, redirect. 12 meters away before the target's nervous system has finished processing what just happened. I was 6 meters behind her, then 4, then 2. My hand was on the strap. What happened next, I have replayed in my memory more times than I can count, and each time I find something new that makes it somehow worse. She stopped. Not stumbled, not paused. Stopped the way a structural wall stops completely without any preliminary signal at a speed that should not have been physically possible given her prior momentum. My forward motion carried me directly into her, and she had turned. Not after I ran into her. At the same instant, as though she had known exactly where I would be when she stopped, calculated the collision angle, and oriented herself to meet it all in the same motion, all in under 1 second. I was looking at her face from approximately 30 centimeters. Her pulse, which I was still reading on reflex, had not changed. 58. The bag was on her shoulder, my hand was still on the strap, and she was looking at me with an expression I had not prepared for because, in 15 years of this profession, I had seen fear, and I had seen anger, and I had seen the particular blankness of someone whose brain has temporarily stopped processing what is happening to them. What I had not seen before was someone who looked genuinely mildly interested. Huh, she said. Just that. Huh, I started. Forearms, she said, looking at me with the focused attention of someone cataloging a curiosity. Her gaze moved across my secondary set with the same calm assessment she had been applying to the market corridor 30 seconds ago. Scavel right, you're supposed to be fast. I was about to respond when Bricks, who had been positioned 15 meters back, specifically so that if things went wrong, he would have the option of not being involved, came up from behind and grabbed the bag from the other side. What happened to Bricks took 1.8 seconds. I know this because I counted afterward from memory using the spectral motion data my eyes had automatically recorded. 1.8 seconds from the moment his hands contacted the bag to the moment he was on the floor of the lower market corridor with his wrists secured behind him and an expression on his face that I can only describe as a complete restructuring of his understanding of how the universe worked. She had not dropped the bag. She had not raised her voice. She had not called for help or made any sound that the ambient noise of the market corridor would have registered as unusual. She had simply moved with the efficient economy of someone for whom this was not a remarkable situation, and Bricks had stopped being a standing problem and become a horizontal one. The entire corridor had gone very quiet. She looked down at Bricks, then she looked at me, then at the bag still on her shoulder unmoved as though none of the previous several seconds had occurred. Then she looked at the zip tie on Bricks's wrist, checked the tension with 2 fingers, and apparently satisfied that it was correct, straightened up and dusted her hands off. I want to be clear about something. She checked whether she had heard him. In the middle of a field operation after restraining a criminal who had just attempted to rob her, her first instinct was to verify she had not caused more damage than necessary. I found this genuinely disorienting. "You want to sit down," she said, "or are you going to make this interesting?" And that is when I saw them. 3 of them, in the corridor. They had been there the entire time and I had not seen them. I want you to understand what that means for a scavel with 17 spectrum vision who had been working this specific corridor for 6 rotations. I had not seen them, not because they were invisible, because they had been positioned and still and ordinary looking in a way that my pattern recognition had filed under background and moved past the way you move past something that does not register as a threat because it does not register at all. One was leaning against a market stall 10 meters to my left. Tall, calm, watching me with the relaxed attention of someone who was waiting to see whether they needed to stand up. He had been standing there, I now realized, since before I started my approach. I had looked directly at him twice. One was near the secondary exit, shorter arms crossed with an expression I can only describe as professionally patient, the stance of someone who had done this before and was prepared to do it again for as long as it took. The third was directly behind me. I only knew this because I heard him say very quietly, very close to my left ear, "Morning." I did not move. There are moments in a professional career where the correct response is absolute stillness, and this was one of them. "We're not here for trouble." His voice was unhurried, substantial. The kind of voice that had decided somewhere along the way that urgency was a resource to be conserved. "We're here because this corridor has been seeing a lot of activity, and our employer wanted someone to take a look." I turned my head, slowly. Slowly enough that it was clearly not a movement of any concern to anyone. He was human, mid-30s, short beard, the kind of eyes that have processed a significant number of events and reached a state of general unsurprise. He was holding nothing in his hands, which was somehow more alarming than if he had been holding something, because a weapon was a known quantity and this man's empty hands were not. "Your partner's fine," he said with a slight gesture toward Bricks on the floor. Embarrassed mostly. From the floor, Bricks made a sound of confirmation. "Who are you people?" I said. I was surprised by how steady my voice was. "I have chosen to count this as a personal victory." The woman answered. She had crouched beside Bricks and was checking his wrists with the automatic practiced care of someone making sure she had not caused more damage than intended. The consideration in the gesture was genuinely disorienting given the context. "We're consultants," she said. "Security consultants," the man behind me clarified, "hired by station management. There's been a significant uptick in what they're calling opportunistic property redistribution in the lower market. About 8 rotations now. That is, I started. A very polite way of saying theft." "Yes," she stood, dusting her hands off. She looked at me and there was something in her expression that I was only beginning to learn how to read. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter than either of those things. The particular look of someone who has done a job many times and is good at it and is no longer surprised by the outcomes. "We know." She looked at the bag on her shoulder. She looked at me. And she said nothing more because at the far end of the corridor, coming at the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had walked this road too many times to be in any particular hurry about it, was Officer Tane Vosk of Vorokneth Station Security. He was a Grenny, broad gray-skinned with the permanent expression of someone who had chosen this career in a moment of occupational optimism that the subsequent years had methodically corrected. He had been a security officer on Vorokneth for 15 years. He knew my name. We had an ongoing professional relationship that I would describe generously as mutually exhausting. He looked at the corridor. He looked at Bricks on the floor. He looked at the 3 humans arranged around me with the patient, unhurried calm of people who had decided how a situation was going to end and were simply waiting for the situation to agree. Then he looked at me. "Zael Koss," he said. "Officer Vosk," I said. "Third time this rotation cycle. I prefer to think of it as consistent employment." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the woman who had already produced some form of identification and was holding it out to him with the practiced ease of someone who did this regularly. Tane Vosk looked at the identification. His expression did something complicated. It moved through tired resignation, passed through surprised recognition, continued through something that looked briefly like relief, and settled somewhere in the vicinity of careful respect, which for Tana Vosk was roughly equivalent to everyone else throwing a significant celebration. "You're the Veil unit," he said. "We are," she confirmed. He gestured at Brix at me at the general situation with the resigned energy of a man who has made his peace with his life. "You two are coming with me," he said. "Obviously," I said. Obviously, Brix agreed from the floor with considerable feeling. And that should have been the end of it. The usual process. The processing, the charges, the fine I would spend the next several rotations paying off. I had been through it enough times that it had a certain grim comfort to it, the way things that are unpleasant but familiar are still preferable to things that are unpleasant and unknown. But the woman whose name I would shortly learn was Rin Vale said something that changed the direction of the next several hours of my life. And though I did not know it yet, a great deal more than that. "Actually, officer," she said, "can I have 10 minutes with them first?" Tone Vosk looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression of complete and uncomplicated sincerity. He looked at her identification again. 10 minutes, he said. He walked to the end of the corridor without another word. I watched him go. Rin Vale turned to face me. The man with the short beard, Corvin I would learn, moved to stand beside her. The tall one from the market stall drifted closer. The shorter one from near the exit repositioned herself with a natural ease that in any other context would have looked like simple movement, but which I recognized professionally as a practiced reestablishment of a perimeter. Brick, still on the floor, looked up at me. I don't suppose he said this is the part where we run. I looked at Rin Vale, at the bag on her shoulder that had not moved, at the calm in her pulse that had not changed since the moment I first saw her walking down the corridor. 58, I said. She tilted her head slightly. Your resting heart rate, I said. It has not changed once. Not when I approached. Not when your partner put a zip tie on Bricks. Not now. There was a pause. Good eyes, she said. Or eyes, I suppose. She looked at me with those dark, steady eyes. Come on, she said, let's talk. Rin did not begin with the offer. I noticed that. A less careful person might have moved immediately to the point, what she wanted, what she was willing to give for it, the basic architecture of a transaction. That was how these conversations usually went in my experience, when they happened at all, instead of simply ending with restraints and a security escort. She began with technique. Your first hesitation was at 4 meters, she said. You adjusted your approach angle, which you did not need to do. There was no obstacle. The adjustment came from uncertainty about your target's movement pattern, which means you had already noticed something that made you uncomfortable and had decided to proceed anyway. I said nothing. Your second hesitation was when Brick started moving. You knew he was going to do something before he did it, and for approximately 1 second you considered stopping him. 1.3 seconds, I said before I could stop myself. She did not smile, but something in her expression shifted slightly, the way a door shifts when the pressure on the other side changes. 1.3, she said, and you still didn't stop him. 50 credits, I said, and professional pride, both are more dangerous than they look. She considered this. Then she said, your approach was actually clean. Cleaner than anything we logged in this corridor over 6 rotations. The forearm coordination, especially that transition from hook to redirect, is something I've read about but not seen executed at that speed. You were watching me before today. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it directly, which was itself an answer. I returned the evaluation, I said. Since we are doing this, she waited. Your bait construction was well designed. The visual weight of the bag implied significant contents without being obvious about it. Your team's positioning was excellent. I looked directly at Thresh twice and categorized him as background. That is not easy to achieve with a Scavel's visual range. And your own heart rate control is either natural trained or pharmacological, and I am genuinely uncertain which. Trained, she said. I filed that away. Corvin, the man with the short beard, was standing to her left and slightly behind. I had been running a continuous thermal scan on the group since the moment I had decided that running was not a viable option. It was a habit, 15 years of reading rooms. That was when I saw it. Left side, below the ribcage, a concentrated thermal signature that did not match the ambient warmth of his core, a specific contained heat that I knew from experience. Not current injury, not old, 4 days approximately. A wound that had been treated but had not finished closing. He was carrying it well. His posture compensated in a way that was practiced enough that it would read as normal to anyone not looking in the right spectrum. But the pain management required to stand like that, to move like that, was not insignificant. Something had gone wrong before they arrived at Vorkneth, and he was letting me see it. Not by accident. By the time I understood that Corvin had already met my gaze with an expression that confirmed it, he had positioned himself in my sightline, knowing I would scan him. He had let the wound be visible in the spectrum he understood I would use. It was an invitation to draw a conclusion. I drew it. Your team is short, I said. Neither of them responded immediately. Whatever you were doing before this assignment, I said it did not go the way you planned. You are here with 4 people, and you should be here with more. That is why you are having this conversation at all. If you had full capacity, you would not need to recruit from the local correction system. Rin looked at me for a moment. Then she said, you're better at this than your file suggests. What does my file suggest? That you're competent, consistent, and significantly underutilizing your capabilities. I looked at her. That is the most backhanded recruitment pitch I have encountered in 15 years. It's not a pitch yet, she said. It's a conversation. I told you there was a difference. What she told me next, I have spent considerable time since trying to find a way to describe that conveys the full weight of it without simply saying it rearranged the furniture of the last 15 years of my life while I was still standing in the room. She told me about the data crystal, small storage device, encoded, containing a list of intelligence assets operating under deep cover within the Galactic Commerce Authority's Security Division, identities, locations, contact networks. The kind of information that, in the wrong hands, would not just end careers, it would end people. Stolen 6 days ago. The theft had happened on Vorakneth, in the lower commercial quarters, during a period of elevated foot traffic that had provided ideal cover for a clean extraction. Corvin placed a data display on the surface between us. On it was a map of the lower market quarter, levels 5 through 8, with movement patterns overlaid, time-stamped, color-coded. I looked at the map. I looked at the movement patterns. I looked at them for a long time, because I recognized them. Not because I had been there, not because I had seen them before in documentation, because they were mine. Every quarter I had worked in the past 3 years was on that map. Every rotation cycle, every position, every approach pattern. My movements documented across 37 months displayed with a precision that went considerably beyond what station security had in their files. Someone had been watching me for 3 years, and then someone had been using what they learned. The pattern on that map was not just a record of where I had been. It was infrastructure. Every time I worked a section of the lower market security, attention concentrated on me naturally, appropriately, because I was in fact doing something worth watching. And in the space that attention created in the gap between where security was looking and where they were not, something else had been moving. For 3 years, I had been a distraction, not recruited, not consulted, not compensated. Used. I did not say anything for a while. The corridor continued its layered sound around us. Vendors' ventilation footsteps. I became aware at some point that Brix had gone quiet as well. He was still on the floor, wrist still secured, and he had been looking at the display from his angle and had arrived at more or less the same understanding I had, and for once in his life, he did not have anything to add to it. The Brix silence was in its own way the most disorienting part of the entire morning. We don't know yet who built the network, Rin said. We don't know how long they've been operating. What we know is that the crystal moved through this corridor 6 days ago using your movement pattern as cover, which means someone in that network understood your habits well enough to time a transfer around them. And you need me to tell you what I saw, I said. We need a great deal more than that, she said. But that is where it starts. I thought about 6 days ago, the morning I had worked level 6 East section running a standard rotation. I had not been particularly focused. There had been a good mark near the transit hub early on which had occupied most of my attention, and afterward I had moved through the secondary corridor without much deliberate observation. But I remembered something. A merchant, gray coat, at a stall I did not recognize as a regular presence, which I should have noted and had not because I had been watching something else. I remembered the coat. I remembered the stillness of someone who was very carefully not drawing attention. I was about to say this when Brix spoke. He said the stall at marker 7. We looked at him. Brix was looking at a point approximately 15 meters down the corridor with the expression of someone who had been staring at the same thing for 40 minutes and had only just decided it was worth mentioning. The one with the blue panels, he said. The vendor there. He has done 3 exchanges in the time I have been on this floor. I looked at marker 7. I had not been watching marker 7. I had been watching Ryan, watching Corvin, running thermals, processing the map, managing the considerable internal disruption of learning that my professional life had been used as cover for something I wanted no part of. Marker 7 had been background. Brix, who had nothing to do for 40 minutes except lie on a floor and look at things, had been watching marker 7 the entire time. Not because he was tactical, not because he had identified it as significant, simply because it was there and he had nowhere else to look, and Brix, whatever his considerable limitations, had never once in 6 years looked away from something that was happening in front of him. The vendor at the stall was a Sithani slight, quick-handed with a particular kind of stillness that was not natural stillness, but practiced stillness, the kind you developed when you needed to look unremarkable. He had exchanged something small with a granny in worker coveralls 22 minutes ago, something small with a hooded figure 12 minutes ago, something small with a scabble not me 8 minutes ago. Not goods, not credits, something smaller. He is packing up, Brick said. Folding the display, he is going to leave. Rin looked at Corvin. Corvin's jaw tightened, barely perceptible. He touched his left side, not consciously, the gesture of someone reminding themselves of a limitation they would rather not have. 4 people, Rin said quietly, 1 positioned at each exit. That leaves the approach uncovered. She looked at me. Not an appeal, not a demand, just a look that contained a question that I was entirely free to answer however I chose. The vendor at marker 7 was folding his display with the methodical efficiency of someone who had a schedule to keep. He would be at the secondary exit in under 4 minutes. After that, he would be in the transit corridors where tracking became significantly more complicated, and whatever he was carrying would move to the next point in a network that had apparently been operating around me for 3 years without my knowledge. First, Rin said, holding out a flat device to Bricks, this overrides the tracking lock within a 50-meter radius. You can move freely. If you run it, deactivates and the station alert triggers automatically. She looked at him steadily. That's not a threat. It's just how the device works. Bricks looked at the device. He looked at me. He looked at the device again. That is a shorter chain, he said. It's a choice, she said. Corvin crouched beside Bricks and removed the zip tie. Bricks sat up slowly and rubbed his wrists. He accepted the override device and looked at it in his palm for a moment, with the careful attention of someone reading the terms of an agreement they had already decided to sign. He stood up. His knees were stiff. He did not complain about this, which was in its own way the most significant thing that had happened all morning. I looked at Bricks. He looked back at me from his new standing position with the quiet expression he had been wearing on the floor. Not his usual expression, something that looked more than anything like tiredness. The expression of a person who has spent 40 minutes horizontal thinking about things and has arrived at a place they do not entirely have words for. The conversation about the job, Rin said, has become somewhat time-sensitive. I looked at the corridor, 15 years of it, every corner, every sight line, every approach angle and exit route, and position where a person could stand and look like nothing in particular while watching everything. I had learned this corridor the way you learn the layout of a place you have lived for a long time, not by studying it, but by moving through it until it became automatic. I had learned it turned out for someone else. I already know this corridor better than anyone you have, I said. She said nothing. The vendor picked up his case. He turned toward the secondary exit. I started walking. I had spent 15 years learning how to walk through Vorakneth without being seen. This is a specific skill. It is not invisibility. It is not disguise. It is the cultivation of a particular quality of presence, or rather the deliberate absence of one. You learn to move at the speed of the crowd and not against it. You learn which surfaces draw the eye and which ones don't. You learn that the most effective form of concealment is not hiding, but belonging, and that belonging is simply a matter of moving like someone who has always been there and is going somewhere ordinary. I had never in 15 years used this skill to close the distance between myself and a target I intended to stop rather than rob. It felt different. I noticed that. The vendor at marker 7 had a transit case in his right hand and a particular quality of movement that I recognized from the other side of the equation, the careful, unhurried walk of someone who did not want to look like they were in a hurry, which was itself a form of hurry if you knew how to read it. I knew how to read it. I came up from behind and to his left, matching his pace in a sequence of adjustments, so gradual they registered as nothing. Not approach, just 2 people moving in the same direction at the same speed in a busy corridor, which is not an event, which is simply a corridor. Behind me, at distances, I was tracking on thermal. Rin had moved to the secondary exit, blocking it without standing in front of it, a technique that required a specific kind of stillness. Thresh was 20 meters to the right, drifting parallel. To my left, moving with a quiet efficiency that I had not heard or seen, Dren had slipped past 2 vendor stalls and was now angling toward the north end of the corridor, where Tani Vosk stood at the security post, repositioning herself with the unhurried patience of someone who knew exactly where she needed to be and had already calculated how long it would take to get there. Corvin was at the security post at the corridor's north end speaking to Tana Vosk. I was running continuous thermals out of habit. What I read from Vosk at the edge of my range stopped me thinking about the vendor entirely for exactly 2 seconds. Vosk's thermal signature was wrong. Not the mild elevation of professional stress, the kind that came with an unexpected complication on an ordinary shift. This was the specific, high-concentrated heat of someone whose body had made a decision about the situation before their mind had finished processing it. Pulse visible at the throat, microperspiration along the jawline. The particular pattern of someone who was not surprised by what Corvin was telling him. Someone who had already known it was coming. I filed it, continued moving. 4 meters behind the vendor now. His gait had shifted barely a fraction, the way a person shifts when some peripheral sense has registered something without yet identifying what. I recognized this too. I had caused it in other people many times. It was the moment just before a target became aware that something was wrong. I did not have the zip tie. I did not have, honestly, any clear plan for what happened when I reached him that extended much beyond reaching him and making further movement difficult. What I had was 15 years of experience in the lower corridors of Vorkneth and a genuine, freshly formed personal investment in this particular outcome. 2 meters. He turned. Not fully. 45 degrees, a check, the kind of look you give a corridor when instinct has suggested it without giving you a reason. His eyes moved past me, through me, almost in the way eyes do. When they're looking for a threat, they have a specific shape for, and I was not that shape. I was just a scabble. In a corridor I had worked for 6 rotations. I belonged here. His eyes moved on. 1 meter. I reached out, 2 hands for the case, 2 for his arm, the coordination automatic, the motion something my body executed before my conscious mind had finished issuing the instruction. The case came free. He reacted fast, faster than I had expected, which recalibrated several assumptions I had been making about who he was and what he had trained for. He pulled left and accelerated, the smooth acceleration of someone who had rehearsed exactly this, who had known the moment would come eventually, and had thought about what they would do when it did. He was fast. The problem was the corridor. And I knew the corridor. Level 6 East Section Secondary Market. I had mapped every structural feature of this space over 6 rotations without meaning to the way you absorb the geography of a place you inhabit. I knew the ventilation housing that narrowed the walkway to 60% capacity at Junction 4. I knew the merchant display that jutted 2 additional feet into the corridor at Marker 9, invisible from the approach angle he was taking. I knew the maintenance access panel at floor level near the east wall that sat slightly proud of the surface, a single centimeter of raised edge that nobody who did not know it was there would account for in a running stride. I did not need to be faster than him. I just needed to be ahead of him. I cut left through the bioluminescent display, the organisms pulsing blue and startled violet as I passed through their perimeter and came out at Junction 4 at the moment he arrived at the narrow point which caused him to adjust, which cost him a step, which was enough. What actually stopped him was Bricks. Bricks, who was supposed to be a liability. Bricks, who I had kept around for 6 years specifically because there was always a chance things would go wrong and he was slower than me. Bricks, who had no tactical training, no combat experience beyond 4 years of back alley disagreements, and absolutely no planned role in the current operation. Bricks had simply walked to the place that looked like where someone running from something would end up and stood there. Not a block, not an intercept, just a short green thorax standing in the middle of a corridor, rubbing his wrists, looking at nothing in particular. The vendor pulled up short. In the half-second he spent recalculating, Thresh was beside him. It was very quiet, very fast, and very final. Dren reached Voss at the same moment the vendor stopped running. I watched her from across the corridor. She did not approach him like a threat. She approached him the way you approach someone when you want them to understand that what happens next is going to be quiet, and that quiet is in everyone's immediate interest, and that the only remaining decision is whether that quiet is comfortable or not. She said 3 words. I was too far away to read them. Vosk looked at her. Then he looked at the corridor around him, at the way it had been without his noticing arranged, and he made the calculation that it was his job to help other people make. His shoulders dropped a centimeter, a very specific centimeter. They walked together toward the north corridor. Not quickly, not under any visible duress, no restraints, no raised voices. The corridor continued around them as though nothing had occurred because nothing visible had. I found standing there with the transit case in my hands that I was angrier than I had expected to be. Not at Vosk specifically. Vosk was one data point in a pattern I was still assembling. The anger was at the pattern itself, at the clean structural elegance of it, the way it had used the most ordinary version of me, the daily working version, the version I had thought of as simply doing a job, and had turned that into something I had no knowledge of and no say in. Rin appeared beside me. I had not heard her approach. Good, she said. Quiet. Meaning the corridor, meaning Vosk, meaning the absence of a public incident that would have complicated the next several hours considerably. You knew about Vosk already, I said. She took the transit case from my hands. We suspected, she said. We needed confirmation in real time from a source that could read what he was feeling before he could manage it. You needed me to look at him. She said nothing. I thought about the morning, about the bag, about the way she had walked the corridor at a specific pace and looked at the space between things with the eyes of someone who had already learned the shape of what she was looking for. She had not been fishing. She had been collecting what she already knew was there. I looked at the transit case. Is it in there? She set it down, opened it, and found the crystal in less than 15 seconds in a secondary compartment wrapped in a signal dampening material nested inside what appeared to be legitimate cargo documentation with the practiced concealment of a professional. She held it up. It was smaller than I expected, the size of a thumbnail, the kind of object you could move through a corridor in a coat pocket and no one would ever know it was there. She turned it over once, then she placed it into a reader she produced from the bag and waited for the decryption sequence. The reader confirmed. Rin looked at the screen. She went very still. I was watching her face because I watch faces. It is what I do. It is what 15 years have trained into me, as automatic as breathing, and what I saw was not what I expected. I had expected relief, the specific unwinding of a held tension, the thermal signature of a body that has been carrying weight and has just been permitted to set it down. What I saw was the opposite, a tightening, contained, the kind of thing you only caught if you were reading the right spectrum at the right moment. She handed the reader to Corvin without speaking. Corvin looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at me. He turned the reader. The first name on the list was displayed in standard galactic script, clean and formal, and ordinary looking in the way that names on official documents always looked ordinary regardless of what they meant. I read it. I read it again. The name belonged to a merchant I had known for 4 years, a reliable client, the kind of contact that sustained a long career in a difficult profession, someone who paid well, asked for specific things, and never required more explanation than necessary. He had hired me to work certain quarters at certain times. He had paid a premium for what he called consistency of pattern, and I had thought this was simply the preference of someone who understood the value of an established professional relationship. He had wanted me working specific sections at specific times because security followed me, and when security followed me, other things moved unobserved. For 4 years. And before me, Corvin turned to the next page, there had been someone else. A Dravani courier who had worked the transit hubs on level 3. Before that, a Hethian vendor with a stall on level 8. The network had been running for 9 years using rotating covers, and I had been the most recent and most productive one because a Scavel with 17 spectrum vision and 15 years of local knowledge drew security attention more reliably than almost anyone else they could have found. I said nothing for a while. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. The specific silence of someone who is processing a rearrangement, who is standing in a room whose walls have just moved and is waiting for their sense of the space to catch up with the new dimensions. Brix had stopped watching the bioluminescent organisms. He was looking at me with that quiet expression he had worn when he was on the floor. The one that was not his usual expression. The one that looked more than anything like tiredness. Zale, he said. I know, I said. You couldn't have known. The result is the same, I said. Rin said, no, it isn't. I looked at her. Being deceived and being complicit are not the same thing, she said. The fact that you can't immediately feel the difference doesn't mean the difference isn't real. I thought about this. I thought about 15 years of clean work, my word for it, my framing the professional standard I had told myself I maintained. Nothing violent, nothing messy, a code. I had believed in the code the way you believe in something you built yourself, which is with the particular conviction of a person who has confused construction with truth. The code was real. What I had not known was what the code had been covering. You knew what the first name would be before you opened it, I said to Rin. She looked at me directly. We had a short list of probable assets, she said. He was on it. You knew him too, I said. It was not a question. She held the look for a moment. Then she said, it doesn't affect the work. But it is a cost, I said. A pause. She said yes. There is something in that acknowledgement that I have thought about many times since. Not the content of it, the simple yes, but the way she said it. Without performance, without the professional deflection, that would have been easier and would have told me nothing useful. Just the word placed between us, meaning what it said. It told me more about who she was than everything else that morning combined. The lower market corridor of Vorokneth took approximately 4 minutes to return to its ordinary state after the incident at Marker 7. 4 minutes for the briefly disrupted foot traffic to redistribute, for the vendors who had paused to resume their calls. The bioluminescent organisms cycled through their blues and greens and deep pulsing violets, indifferent as always. Brix found a food stall 11 meters from the display and acquired through what I chose not to inquire about too closely, 4 containers of something that smelled genuinely acceptable. We sat at a small table, the kind of unremarkable surface that existed at intervals throughout the market corridor, for no official purpose, but which had been used for every imaginable unofficial one over the station's 40-year history. I put Corvin's contact card on the table between us. I had been carrying it for 40 minutes. I had not yet picked it up again. Rin pulled the notebook from her bag and set it beside the card. She opened it to the last used page, which was dense with handwritten notation. Station names, corridor designations, dates, observations in her particular compact script. She turned past it to the first blank page. She placed a pen across the top of it. She did not say anything. Brix ate. He ate with the focused application of someone who had not eaten since early morning and had spent a significant portion of the intervening hours horizontal on composite flooring. He looked at the notebook, at the card, at me, and then back at his food. I said, "The tracking device." She reached into the bag and held out her hand to Brix. He placed the override unit in her palm without being asked. She returned it to whatever pocket it had come from. "You built the bait operation for a corridor you had already mapped," I said. "You positioned your team before the morning started. You knew where I worked and when. You knew what I would see and what I would miss because you had studied how I operated." She was listening. "You were better prepared than I was," I said, "and I was on my own ground." She said, "That's not a small thing. Most people we approach in corridors like this one, they don't understand how thoroughly they've been prepared against. They feel the disadvantage without being able to name it." And I named it. "You named it," she said, accurately and quickly, and while managing a significant amount of new information. She looked at me steadily. "That is why we're sitting here instead of Officer Vosk filing a report." Brix looked up. "I have a question," he said. Corvin looked at him. "Am I part of this conversation," Brix said, "or am I here because of the tracking device?" A pause. Thresh, from his position slightly removed from the group, said, "Honestly, both." Brix considered this with the philosophical equanimity of a man who had accepted more unflattering truths in the past several hours than he usually managed in a rotation cycle. "That is fair," he said. He returned to his food. I looked at the blank page in the notebook. I had spent 15 years building expertise in how systems failed, how coverage patterns created gaps, how the attention of security personnel could be directed and redirected, how movement through a space left signatures that could be read if you knew which spectrum to use. I had built this expertise in service of one application. The application had, as of this morning, been revealed to have been itself an application of something larger, something I had not consented to and would not have. "Helix Station," I said, "4th level commercial corridor." Rin said, "You've worked it." 2 rotations, 18 months ago. Level 4 runs a transit market on odd cycles. The coverage pattern has a structural gap on the eastern walkway because the ventilation housing creates a visual block from the main security position. She picked up the pen. She held it out. I looked at it for a moment. 15 years of operating in the lowest sections of the galactic criminal ecosystem had taught me, above almost everything else, to be skeptical of invitations. Invitations were setups. Invitations were the moment before the trap. An open hand was something you read for concealed weight before you decided whether to take it. I read her. 58 beats per minute. Not performance, not management. Just the resting state of someone who was underneath the considerable professional capability, in the careful stillness, in the thing she was carrying about the name on that list, genuinely at ease with what she was offering. I took the pen. Brix beside me said nothing, which was, if you knew Brix, the loudest possible endorsement. I wrote the first word. Just the station name. 8 letters. Rin looked at it. Something crossed her face that was not the professional calm or the careful assessment or the thing she kept closed when the list came up. Something smaller than any of those. The expression of a person who does not let themselves want things very openly and has, in a small, specific moment, let something show. It was there for less than a second. I have 17 spectrum vision. I saw it. I wrote the second word. And I thought about what it meant, not the job, not the particulars of what Rin Vale and her team did and what I might do alongside them, but the motion itself, the act of writing forward instead of backward, of contributing to a record instead of evading one. For 15 years, I had understood myself to be a certain kind of person, doing a certain kind of work with a certain kind of code. The code had been real. I had not been wrong about that. But I had been operating in a space whose boundaries I had not fully seen, and the things I had believed about the shape of my own life had been in certain significant ways the beliefs of a person who was only reading part of the available spectrum. I had 17 spectrum eyes. I had been using, in the end, perhaps 4 of them on myself. The notebook page was no longer blank. I wrote the section on Helix Station Level 4 Eastern Walkway Ventilation Housing, gap optimal approach, angles, timing pattern for the transit market on odd cycles. I wrote what I had seen. I wrote what the gaps looked like from the outside. I wrote it in the precise, specific language of someone who had spent 15 years finding weaknesses in systems and was now for the first time writing them down for the purpose of closing them. It took 11 minutes. When I put the pen down, Rin read the page without picking up the notebook. She read it the way she had read the quarter that morning, with the focused attention of someone looking at the space between things rather than the things themselves. Then she looked at me with those dark, steady eyes and said simply, "Good." Just that. Good. Bricks beside me picked up the contact card from the table. He looked at it. He set it back down, but closer to my side than before. I looked at him. He looked at his food. I looked at the notebook, at the page I had filled, at the blank pages still remaining after it, which were, if I was counting, considerable. And I thought about the merchant in the gray coat, about the 9 years, about the way a network like that operated patient structural, using the ordinary movements of ordinary lives as its architecture. About how many corridors there were on how many stations where someone was right now walking a pattern they had learned without knowing who had designed it for them or why. About how many pages that would take. I reached out and picked up the contact card. The table was small. The corridor was loud and ordinary around us. Traders calling their wares the transit schedule, announcing its updates in 6 languages. The bioluminescent organisms doing what they had always done in their case of blue and green and violet. Corvin finished his food. Thresh said something quiet to Dren, who had returned from the north corridor, and nodded once in the particular way of someone confirming that a thing has been handled. Brix asked in a conversational tone whether the offer of a shorter chain extended to any kind of official designation, or whether that was a separate conversation entirely, and Thresh told him that was a considerably separate conversation, and Brix accepted this with the expression of someone filing it under future agenda items rather than closed doors. I put the contact card in my interior coat pocket. Rin turned to the next blank page of the notebook and placed the pen on top of it. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Zylkos, 15-year veteran of the lower corridors, 4 arms and 17 spectrum eyes and a professional record that Tanavosk had apparently committed to memory, sat at a small, unremarkable table in the lower market corridor of Vorokneth and understood for the first time with any real clarity the difference between knowing a space and understanding what you are doing inside it. They were not the same thing. The gap between them was exactly the size and shape of everything that came next. And somewhere in that gap, for the first time in 15 years, he had absolutely no idea what that was. He found to his very great surprise that this felt less like danger and more like the beginning of something worth knowing.